I'm Elena, not Ondrea, as you
Oh,
should know. So I'm starting out. We were contracted to look at restoration sites in the Albuquerque reach, ranging from the Corrales area down to the border with the Isleta Pueblo. And we did these surveys from 2017 to 2019. Construction was completed between 2011 and 2015. So we're looking at sites that are composed of different feature types, swales, terraces, backwaters, and they were constructed at different points in time. We surveyed for Willow, Flycatcher, Cuckoo, and habitat suitability for these species, which I'm going to talk about today. And then we also did vegetation composition assessments at these sites, changes in topography, and general avian community use, which Huxeloff presented earlier. And during this time, we had drastically different flow conditions. In 2018, flow was well below the 45-year average, whereas in 2017 and 2018, during the spring runoff and monsoon season, at many points in time, it was at or above the average. And in 2019, those high flows, the duration of high flows was for a much longer period of time than in 2017. So our restoration features inundated in 2017 and 2019, and with that period of inundation lasting longer in 2019. Now, so far, we're only seeing flycatcher detections in May during our first survey period, indicating these sites are used as stopover habitat, not breeding or nesting. However, that stopover habitat is pretty important. We expect this use to change as that vegetation matures. Keep in mind that some of these sites are as new as 2016, so that vegetation really hasn't reached that critical maturity. And we can't say anything about statistical significance with our results because we have a relatively small number of sites. This is 3 years of data, a low number of detections. But the thing to keep in mind here is this vegetation is maturing throughout the study period, will continue to mature. And the take home message here is that in 2017 and 2019, when our sites inundated, we had twice as many detections as in 2018 when those sites remained dry. And as Dave talked about earlier today, most of our detections are occurring in that dense, taller stature willow when it's inundated. And we are seeing changes with that willow maturing, like in site 1A. It started out pretty sparse, low stature. And once that reached this a critical density and we had the inundation, we started getting those detections in 2019. Now, to maintain the suitability of these sites for the flycatcher, it's really important to maintain that connection to groundwater or surface water through inundation to support that riparian native vegetation. And as we talked about, it's important to have that standing water and that dense vegetation to support the flycatcher, and as well as meeting the minimum patch size requirement. And we have to keep in mind that this is a managed system. Many of the river processes have been disrupted. So this is going to require continual maintenance. And we have to keep in mind that these features, they may be suitable at one point in time, but are going to mature to a point where they're not suitable, which is why it's important to keep building these restoration features to maintain habitat suitability. And we also have to keep in mind that invasive vegetation management is going to be an ongoing issue and very important for maintaining that habitat suitability. And so far, these restoration features are only borderline suitable habitat for cuckoo. Like Kristen talked about, it really doesn't have the understory density, but it is improving with time. We had one single detection at a site where we really weren't expecting it in 2018. Maybe a beta male, I'm not sure what was going on with that guy. But it's also important to keep in mind, like Huxeloff talked about earlier, these restoration sites are important for the general avian community and many other riparian obligate species. And we have to consider the whole community, not just these 2 endangered species.
Tag on in. Okay, so I just want to talk a little bit more about sort of the overall restoration concepts that we in the collaborative program have been working on for a long time together. And then I'll show a few specific site examples. So this is just an example here of the Las Lunas site. You know, this is one of the first sites the program did, the Gordon Bureau constructed, looking at trying to combine as many different features, types of habitat as possible. So getting that mosaic, the heterogeneity of habitat, and as large as possible. So I mean, this site in particular was for minnow, flycatcher, and maybe not at the time, but maybe in the future for cuckoo. But the Mid-River Grand Restoration Project areas then sort of took this concept and built upon it in terms of looking at it as many ways we can connect to the river, the floodplain, connect to other sites, especially worked a lot with Grace and ISC on their collaborative program projects so that we could add more features to them and make them bigger. And so one of the things we found, especially for flycatchers, is we get that sometimes immediate use. And I'll show you some examples. So this is what we call the 1E, 1G. This is actually Alameda Boulevard right here, west side, Carlos Bosque. There's a couple of project areas in here, and as Elena mentioned, these were constructed over different periods of time, over 3 or 4 year time span. So this was one of the earlier sites, and part of what I want to show you here is just the different types of features. So the green is swales, willow swale habitat. The blue is a terrace connected swale, and then the dark blue are sort of the backwater connections. So again, just trying to get that heterogeneity of habitat types and as large as possible. So here's what it looked like looking south, that same terrace swale area during the September 2013 flows. This is what it looks like on the ground now. So in terms of that maturing habitat that we're getting, and again, the Albuquerque reach has been mainly for stopover habitat. But I will answer Dave's question about if they're getting more use than just stopover habitat. So here at that site in particular, of course, when we finished construction in 2012 and 2013, we had 13 flycatchers in May. So that immediate use, like I'm talking about. So I try to think of them and saying, what's this? That looks cool. I'm going to check it out. And hoping they might use it more. Obviously, the numbers dropped again, but in the Corrales area, overall, there's a number of restoration sites. This is also the 1A site. This is 1B on San Diego Pueblo. And we get continued use of stopover habitat in May, 1 to 2 detections pretty much every May. So again, just providing that habitat that we know between territories is needed. I'm going to talk a little bit about one of my favorite sites. As many of you know, I spent a lot of time at the San Antonio Expo. I just wanted to show a quick visual of, this is in 1984. This is San Antonio Arroyo. This is the riverside drain. That's where a lot of the main water comes into the Oxbow here. It's a 54-acre wetland. It's not really connected to the river in terms of inflow. It does get outputs that come back out through the system, especially in higher flows. So in 1998, that arroyo was then restructured and engineered and put in more formally for flood control. And part of that also included these berms that were put in. And in 2002, this berm extension. So this created what I call the dead zone here. You can see the dead zone. So back starting when I was with Open Space, we were looking at a project to restore and reconnect that area. And then when I went over to the Corps of Engineers, we were working on the planning for Mid-River Grand Restoration Project, which we finally did, reconnected. Just by basically digging down to shallow groundwater, but we also added in some more bankline features, terraces, backwater. And so part of what I'm showing you here is this change over time, but it's also this linkage with all this, what I call natural habitat. Yes, it was cut off by the river when we put Jackson in 1962, but in terms of habitat for flycatcher, this is all here undisturbed and pretty hard to get to in terms of that human disturbance. So I still am hopeful that someday they will use it. So they do use it for stopover habitat, for sure. Been surveying with the Corps, Stephen and Danielle and others and I out there for many years. And in the last few years, through Tetra Tech, continuing those surveys, getting at least decent numbers in that May stopover habitat use time. The final restoration portion of that project was finished in 2016, so you can see our nice big jump here in 17. And again, a lot of that natural habitat was already there, but maybe making those additional connections and high flows on top of that gave us a higher number of detections. And even in 2018, we had a good amount of detections because there's water there. Even if there wasn't water on the river, there was water in the Oxbow. One thing I also want to point out here again, in terms of being hopeful that someday this might be used for more than just stopover habitat, is that through the Flycatcher prioritization project that we've also been doing for the program that we presented a couple weeks ago. Looking at that distance between territories of less than 10 miles if possible. Just creating these areas, these islands where there's stopover habitat for the flycatchers to use. And like I said, nests someday. This is where I'm hopeful. One last site I want to mention, this is down at I-25 on the west side of the river, north boundary of the Pueblo is right here. So these are two pretty large willow swales that were added to the site. And I say added to the site because some of the clever program restoration work that IC did was some bank line here, so we were trying to add to that. We have good water connection here on what we call Site 5E. And you can see the flows moving in there back in 2016 even. So one thing I wanted to point out that this year we actually didn't have use at 5E, we had use at 5D, and we've had migrants pretty much every May since the construction. But in July, we went out repeatedly, Stephen and went out with me to look for a nest, because I was like, okay, this has never happened in the Albuquerque Reach. So we were able to call it a lone male territory. So Dave, hopeful that doing the restoration work again provides another area, especially close to Isleta where we have had nesting in the past for emergency use. So no nesting affinity fidelity in the Albuquerque Reach yet. But there's lots of places where they can go. Right, so we're hopeful that that will happen. That density of vegetation, as I mentioned, is starting to come up, especially some of the sites that were constructed in 2011, 2012, looking pretty good, as long as we have that water component for habitat food. And in terms of recommendations, we've talked a little bit about some of the funding sources decreasing over time, and so that's also happening. Our recommendations are, especially looking at some of the sites where we're seeing that increased use, but I just showed you a few and there's a couple others, to continue surveying where we can, even if it's every other year, every 2 to 3 years. But then also continuing to update the habitat suitability for both species. Elaine mentioned our one cuckoo detection, but again, that understory habitat is going to be growing up where we already have good overstory and could, again, provide potential habitat for cuckoo. Also the maintenance and adaptive management that we talked about. Adaptive management is needed because the goal of the restoration project was for the sites to function on their own, continue to evolve over time, and hopefully continue to provide habitat. Any questions? Is there time?
I'm trying to link resources here a bit. So
Yeah.
I noticed in 2017, your numbers went way up. Same thing happened with silver minnow. And what we're trying to do is figure out if it's the timing of inundation, the duration, the magnitude. Those are the 3 factors we're looking at. Are you doing something similar for SWFL, for example?
To a degree, in terms of what we just showed you, and we could probably get a little more in depth, and we'll do with some of our other studies. We looked at more detailed information on the floodplain in terms of that involvement of habitat, and especially since we're adding all the habitat restoration sites, almost 1,000 acres, to potentially benefit both minnow and flycatcher during that time period. So 17 also had decent flows, but also that habitat was maturing enough, maybe something similar for minnow. So I mean, yeah, we could look at that picture together.
Yeah, because we're looking at the synchrony of timing of inundation relative to when the fish are ready to spawn.
Right.
And then the duration of that inundation relative to how much inundation the larvae need. Not so much magnitude. In fact, magnitude may not necessarily be better for the silver minnow. So I was just wondering if you were looking at it similarly for SWFL. Thanks.
Definitely. Yeah. Thanks, Rich.
I think just following up on that a little bit is, to make sure that you keep in mind that these are migratory detections, not necessarily sticking around. So in addition to what's going on with hydrology, there's also things kind of out of our control, like with migration and other things that, we might not have control over that is having an impact on the numbers of birds coming through.
Because that hydrology can also affect the food source at the sites and all those other types of things.
You just have to tether the birds and keep them.
No, they would just talk to us.
Kind of on the subject of what may or may not be under our control. Ondrea, do you have any recommendations, as these sites mature and hopefully become suitable habitat? And if they do happen to have nesting in the future, do you have recommendations from land managers in terms of how we can manage use in some of these areas?
That is a deep question. That's what we're all here for, right? I mean, for sure, and I mean, since I've gotten to touch truck, I've had the chance to look at other sites too. So a lot of sites in Coral Reach where Dave is surveying, and see a lot of differences both in existing habitat, restoration projects. I think just finding that balance between restoration, especially when right now we're focused on Tetra's leaf beetle, which we're going to be talking about this afternoon, and getting sites ahead of time for Flycatcher, but maybe looking at it in terms of minimal effort. I mean, a lot of the projects we did, a lot of construction to bring the Musket to the river, so we can connect to the floodplain. But wherever there's also that sort of low-hanging fruit where maybe you just got a little bit of invasives, get some more natives in there, and then you've got something for the Flycatcher to go to, and a balance of all those things, because within each subreach it's a little bit different, and the territory use is different. So maybe looking at it from that perspective as well.
Yeah, I was thinking more in terms of human or recreation use. There's kind of pushes to have more trails and start seeing more use in areas.
Right. In terms of human use, Dave might be able to say a little more how we think that maybe affects Flycatcher birds in general, like Stephen mentioned. I think if they're there, they're there. But it can affect, the numbers. I'll give an example. We used to survey the Central Wasteway, north of Central, on the east side of the river. And then they put the trail in there, the Crusher Pine Trail. And after that, I didn't get Flycatchers anymore. That's not to say that's always going to be the case, but it can definitely affect the birds coming in.
Ondrea, this kind of builds on Yasmin's question, and maybe this is for the broader birding group. What is the optimal balance of bird habitat versus bosky structure for wildfire protection? Those seem in opposition to each other. Is there an optimal spatial mosaic? Is anybody working on what that should look like?
For sure, I'll answer and then others can jump in. We've talked about the mosaic for a while, and for those of you that were at the Grande Conservation Action Plan meeting a couple weeks ago, I went back through all that because that's sort of where it started in the early 2000s, talking about the mosaic of habitat in general on the river, but then also the mosaic of within the bosque, how much overstory, how much understory, how much shrub, how much open area, how much meadow, and definitely we've thrown out some numbers. You want some type of balance in that to have that heterogeneity. I mean, in general, we talked about 50% overstory with some understory, then maybe 25% open meadow, open water, and the other 25% shrub. It's not exactly it, that's just throwing an example out there. But it's definitely something you want to look at when you're trying to balance those needs, because fire danger is a huge issue everywhere, and so you have to try to balance that. So maybe that's where you do your meadows or open water, wetland habitat.
It's a less fire.
And yeah, and less fire resistant.
I think in the plan as it's written now, the recommendation or the goal is to have 7% of type 1. It's fairly dense. So, how does range on the landscape to, make that possible or make it more protected or not? And, it's still a question about how our fire managers and folks who are doing wildfire and management in general will feel about that. But, I think there are creative ways to approach that, whether that's the right number or not. I assume that came from birds.
Yeah, from a bird's perspective. That's gonna change
So that's
where you are.